Hello everyone, and welcome to the second in this series of webinars to address implementing our recommendations for planning reform to support a livable catchment and a swimmable Parramatta River. My name's Nerida Taylor and I work for Sydney Water in the Parramatta River Delivery Engine. I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge the Aboriginal traditional custodians of the land of the Parramatta River and the land on which we are all gathering today. The image on this slide is of a bull shark and it's been engraved into this rock for approximately 250 years, we think. This is at Callan Park. It's on the foreshore of Iron Cove Bay, and we know that the area around Iron Cove has some really deep sections. We know that bull sharks like to rest in those deep holes on the bottom of the river during the day. So this is obviously an early indication from our Aboriginal forebears of, swimming in the Parramatta River and wildlife around the river. We recognise the importance of Aboriginal leaderships in the management of the river, and I would like to pay respect to elders past, present and emerging. Just a little meeting etiquette. This is a short 20-minute presentation with just 10 minutes allocated for question time at the end. Please use the chat or the Q&A function throughout the presentation, and we'll attempt to moderate some questions so we can have a bit of a discussion at that end. If we can't answer all the discussions, if it goes over time, we'll endeavour to get back to you with some answers. And the webinar is recorded and it will be made available on the PRCG, our Living River website. I'm incredibly proud of this work, and we had such a great group of stakeholders involved in developing it and great consultant team as well. So I'd like to take a moment to formally introduce Alexa McCauley from Seville Consulting and Peter Davies, Senior Lecturer in Environmental Planning at Macquarie Uni, who will take you through this presentation. Thank you.
Well, thanks, Nerida. So I'm going to start, I guess, the first few slides, and then we'll hand over to Alexa. But essentially, what we're going to do is talk about new approaches to managing diffuse stormwater pollution. What are the main issues and challenges? And then thinking about this conception of a blue-green index and how that might aim to improve environmental outcomes. So what do we know? So essentially, for a healthy living Parramatta River, we've actually got to address and manage diffuse pollution. Now, this is nothing new. I mean, we've been thinking about water-sensitive urban design controls really since the late 1990s. So these are many decades old in terms of positioning our minds, our policies, our actions around, I guess, some of the insidious issues of diffuse pollution, because it's owned by everyone, it's contributed and caused by everyone, but the responsibilities, if you like, in terms of managing it falls and continues to fall between the cracks. And so essentially what we find from a policy setting is we've got existing approaches that, in theory, work. We have pollution control targets that are modelled and designed to reduce and improve our water quality, but in practice, they're failing to get the traction and outcomes that we need. And I guess by way of an example of Ruby Arden's work in the Northern Beaches has found that people's connection to water-sensitive urban design controls varies depending on where that device is located. If it's in the visible front yard, then it tends to have greater impact and probably greater effectiveness. If it's in the backyard, people cover it over. They do what they like with it. Another example came from Tim Fletcher down at the University of Melbourne the other day when I was speaking to him. And one of the studies that he was looking at was the effectiveness of water-sensitive urban design in a particular catchment. And examining that, 100% of the developments in that catchment had, in theory, good water-sensitive urban design as part of the development application. In practice, 95% in terms of was it built, it wasn't there. So we can clearly see, even though we have great policy frameworks, the limited transfer to on-ground is something that we need to address. So when we start to think about, I guess the causes of the problem and actually what this means, and I'll just go through some of these slides now in a little bit of detail. We know there's going to be a whole bunch of new development within the Parramatta catchment. Now, a lot of that's going to be infill, small local development, complying development, and the capacities to implement good water-sensitive urban design in those smaller sites is quite limited. So the one-size-fits-all is not necessarily going to achieve the best outcomes that we like. We also know our current planning approaches, whether it's water-sensitive urban design controls, whether it's basics, doesn't necessarily lead us to great outcomes. So basics fundamentally is around water efficiency, and it is incredibly good at that. And there's good demonstrable evidence. What it doesn't do is help keep water in the catchment so we can support greener, livable catchments and reduce your stormwater load. And I guess that speaks to, the notion of rainwater harvesting and this focus on efficiency, water efficiency, but not necessarily good integrated urban water outcomes. When we start to think about policy of effectiveness and what that means in terms of the development sector. So the development sector continually say they want certainty. Within that, there's an interesting nuance because we can tell them there's a minimum compliance standard. You have to achieve, you must do certain things. We can have a performance-based system that gives them the options. Or we can have a principles-based system that is far more aspirational, but not necessarily being explicit in terms of outcomes. And so within that spectrum of ideas of development certainty, you have this tension around what the developer must be able to do in order to get their application through the approval body. So thinking about the impact of water-sensitive urban design. What we start to see is there's little incentive in terms of integrating good water-sensitive urban design approaches within the landscape, within that blue-green control. And Alexa will talk a lot about this. But essentially when a development comes into councils, our council colleagues are telling us that if it's a stormwater-related matter, it goes to the water engineers. If it's a landscape-related matter, it goes to the landscape officers. The water-sensitive urban design sometimes will be given to an environment staff, but rarely is there a good integrated approach. And that's one of the shortcomings that we have. There's a fundamental missed opportunity of the streetscape. And when I talk about the streetscape, it's somewhere between the front door and the road. And there's this blurring between the public and the private realm in that highly visible space that determines in many ways what is a good space, what is a good place. In many ways, I'm echoing the good design and place set aspirations here. And we're not focusing enough on that front verge, front yard focus. There are missed opportunities in terms of riparian waterways and riparian zones, and we'll speak more about that next Tuesday. So there's your advertisements to these that are coming next week. In terms of monitoring and compliance, we don't really know essentially if these things work in practice. We do a lot of good modelling, but we don't necessarily do the monitoring to say whether our infiltration systems are working over time. And it's importantly that stress on that is the over time element. So these are structures, these are systems that we put in the landscape that we expect to work almost in perpetuity in order to maintain water in landscape, clean water outcomes. I guess the final thing is funding models in councils. So often local government doesn't have the capacities to fund these in perpetuity. Equally, I would say that individuals might not have the technical capabilities and capacities to manage appropriately the rain gardens that councils require of them as parts of condition and consent. So we need to think about the capacities from that broader perspective, and what tools and what approaches that we can support not only for the management of public assets by councils and other public authorities, but also from a strata perspective, from an individual lot perspective. Alexa.
So we've been asking throughout this project, what could we ask for in new development? And because it's important, we get what we ask for. And at the moment, we've asked for minimum landscape standards, we've set targets for stormwater pollutant loads, and we've got basics which set standards for water efficiency. But if we get development that only meets those standards, as we saw last time, that business as usual approach will actually result in declining water quality in Parramatta River as the catchment develops. So most of us would agree we'd prefer to see better outcomes, but it's important to work out what we can actually ask for. So there's two questions we should consider. One is what's actually required to achieve a healthy living Parramatta River. And the other question is what is actually a reasonable ask of different types and scales of development. So while we might expect Melrose Park here to achieve really top-notch outcomes, what can we actually expect of smaller scale development? That first question is really about the science and isn't so much our focus today. The science completely underpins our thinking, and we will touch on how it's informed the thinking behind the Blue-Green Index. But our focus is more about the planning system today. That's more about that second question, what can we ask for? So our planning system has been evolving over decades to make more complex asks of development and is currently going through a really significant overhaul. One of the things that's been happening is we're reshaping our planning system to address these more complex issues with multiple objectives, longer term goals, and that has necessitated a shift to more sophisticated approaches. So we still have a lot of examples of prescriptive planning controls, but we've also added more performance-based controls, things like the pollutant load targets and basics. And now if you've been listening to the information about the design and place set, the government architects have been talking about how that's a principles-based system. So it establishes the principles and they're supported with design guidelines. And that's somewhat like the approach in the apartment design guide. And we've noted the living waterways framework is one example from the water sector which might fit into that category. So we've been thinking about how each of those approaches relates to diffuse stormwater pollution. And at a simple level, you could say each of those approaches is more relevant at different scales, but it's more than just scale too. So we've got some objectives which are simpler and might be more achievable with prescriptive controls, but we do have some objectives which are more complex and where performance-based and even principles-based controls are more relevant, and perhaps even relevant at the smaller scales if we can make them work at that scale. So at the moment, the principles-based controls, we're seeing them applied to things like the design and place set, and I think it's easier to see how they might work for larger scale development, but would that kind of approach work in this smaller scale infill? We're seeing how hard it is in general for the planning system to drive good design outcomes in that smaller scale infill development and the classic missing middle problem. So for that scale, like we need simple systems and we need some minimum standards, but perhaps there's also an opportunity to drive innovation. And we saw basics do it when it came in and drove innovation in water conservation. And we think about how that translates now to diffuse stormwater pollution. So we are with this smaller scale infill development. And one of the important questions we've been asking ourselves is, what if we had a system which recognised and provided some reward to all of the green and blue infrastructure that was included on site? So instead of just measuring what the treatment system is doing, what if you measured all the benefits of pervious surfaces, soils, vegetation, trees, irrigation and stormwater treatment systems as well? At the moment, if a developer includes some of those elements, it could actually make it harder to meet the stormwater treatment objectives, which is a perverse outcome. And basics also leads to some perverse outcomes, like more irrigated landscape will make it harder to meet the basics targets. So that's one of the risks with those performance-based controls, is that they, while focusing on that single outcome, some of those perverse outcomes can be encouraged instead. So one of the other questions we've been asking is what if we had a system which was better at dealing with the multiple objectives of blue and green infrastructure? So what if it could account for those multiple objectives and encourage the design options that meet multiple objectives and drive innovation in that direction? So we might not get every development looking like this, but at least we could better align our planning system with the objectives we're actually trying to achieve, and hopefully get more of what we really value out of new development. So with all those questions in mind, we looked in this project at a range of existing planning tools that are in various sort of states of adoption and used for different purposes, but all water focused, and examples from locally as well as internationally. And there's a range here from maybe some of the more familiar, like the water quality modelling tools. Some at the top, which are green factor tools, and then some of the more broad-reaching sustainability rating tools. And we talked to stakeholders in this project about what they'd want to see in a planning tool for diffuse stormwater pollution. And I think across the top there, hopefully you can see some of the things that we've just been talking about. We want it to be simple and easy to use. We want it to drive innovation, performance target. We want it to work at a range of scales. And one of the types of tools that emerged strongly as an interesting candidate here was the green factor tools. So these are typically a fairly simple system that sets up a score for every bit of green infrastructure in a development. And they're often set up in Excel, so they're really simple to use. And they weight the scores for different contributions that green infrastructure makes to the outcomes you're trying to achieve. There's often a site-wide target, but then flexibility within the tool about how you meet that overall. And there is the ability there to incorporate different geographic and variability of development and things, a little bit like basic stuff. It sets different targets depending on the geography. These green factor tools are often underpinned by science, and so there is, the science is built into them, but they often, you don't see the science on the surface. And they're not models, but they do incorporate that scientific thinking. And the other point there is that they're not compliance tools, but they do change the way you might assess and improve development. So just quickly through two examples that we looked at, which we thought were particularly relevant to this project. And one is Helsinki's green factor tool, and one is the city of Melbourne. Let's look at each briefly. One of the reasons that we thought Helsinki was an interesting example was that it includes stormwater. While a lot of these examples are really just focused on the green elements, Helsinki, they've tried to bring in the blue elements too, stormwater treatment systems, and things like permeable pavement. And they've just brought it into a simple spreadsheet system. So at the moment it's a voluntary tool, so it's not very sophisticated. It's like a working model that works in a spreadsheet. People can use it, test it out, and they can see how it can be applied to different developments. There's a little snapshot here over 2 pages of what's in it. So there's all these different elements, different types of landscape elements, and you just need to enter simple data about the quantities of each of those elements. And then when it comes to things like the stormwater elements, all those things in blue just link to a little bit more information. But interestingly, it's not asking people to model all those elements necessarily. It's just asking for simple information. How are you going to include a rain garden and what size will it be? Here's some information in our guidelines about what should be like. The City of Melbourne example is really useful to us because it is one of the only Australian examples that's up and running. It's much more focused on green infrastructure rather than the blue, but does include stormwater as one of the things it's trying to achieve as well. It's given that the City of Melbourne, it's focused on higher density inner city development. One of the things about the Melbourne tool is that, and if you look online, you'll find their video that they recorded when they launched the tool. And it's really evident in there, they've put a lot of emphasis on incorporating the science. So when they've set up each factor in there about what each element should score, they've been really careful to incorporate science about those benefits. So what would it achieve in terms of heat island reduction, biodiversity, etc. And that's something that comes through more clearly in the Melbourne tool and some of the international examples we look at. So with this knowledge of green factor tools, we've set about shaping a green factor tool that would suit the Parramatta River catchment. And the paper we've written maps out what this would look like at a framework. I'm back to Peter to tell you more.
Yeah, thanks, Alexa. Excuse me. So when we start to think about emerging policy frameworks that sort of change the way that we think about development, often the reason that we emphasise this, I guess, this iterative process of policy reform rather than transformative one is because we know that, you know, these step changes in policy will always be met with a degree of policy conservatism within governments, because there'll be always pushback from individuals to say, you're changing things too quickly, too fast, we have this uncertainty. So in essence, what we're trying to draw on is existing provisions, existing templates, existing examples. And so basics for as one of those is one that builds on a performance-based system. We know in basics there's some geographic specificity around it in terms of rainfall where you are in the state. Similar to a green-blue index, we could think about different soils within the landscape that might impact on infiltration capacity. So we have models from which we can apply and adapt. The other thing is about focusing on water and landscape concurrently. Now we need, if we're going to have a green city outcome, we're needing to have water to support that. And we know when we don't have that water for irrigation, when we know there are restrictions on our capacities to irrigate our gardens, our greenness starts to brown. So we need provisions to support both the water, the blue bits and the green bits concurrently. When we start to think about multiple objective standards and our overall score, this is fundamentally around giving options and opportunities that reflect site and the aspirations of the developer. And I think the other important thing that Alexa was touching on is these co-benefits and trying to quantify those. So habitats are important. We know from a nature connection, ecology for cities perspective, that having nature within our cities is fundamentally important for our well-being. We know cooler cities are fundamentally important at dealing with that urban heat. And we can only get those cooler cities if we have that water in landscape support those trees and the vegetation during those hot days. We know open space is increasingly at a premium. And so we need to make the best of our open spaces so that they're green and livable and usable. So as we're starting to run out of time, we can think about these various aspects of reducing the amount of water runoff. And there's a whole bunch of good benefits and objectives that we have on those. We can think about that in terms of maximising the pervious area, in terms of that deep soil provision. And lots of councils have good deep soil provisions, but not all. We can think about maximising rainwater harvesting, not just for basics, but for on-site detention, on-site retention, and maintaining that watering landscape. And then also thinking about the infiltration and evapotranspiration perspective. Again, cooler cities, greener cities outcome. And all of those are then come together to then treat any remaining runoff. So, next steps.
Oh, as we just discussed, like I think that this really is the mechanism to, put in place to actually meet these high-level targets that have been put in so many strategic documents around planning for Sydney. So I think this is actually one way we can implement it, and I'm really keen to see this become more than just the concept that it is at the moment, even if it is a very well thought through concept. And so look, we're in terms of the Parramatta River Catchment Group, we're in the process of establishing a working group. I can see this tool being implemented at either the local council level or at the state environmental planning policy level. And so obviously those different pathways will mean that we work in a different way, but what we want to do is to develop an initial pilot. And as Alexa alluded to, a lot of the existing tools are very simple and they've built up over the years. And I think Basics sort of started in a similar vein. It was a pilot project and it grew and it built and it was, used real life examples. And so that's kind of the framework we're hoping to establish for the Blue-Green Index tool. And, really keen for people to partner with us. We're keen to drive this tool into implementation at some scale really soon. So we have set up a sort of a framework for how we want to see that happen. And we have put that into the paper that's being published. And then that's kind of where I see the next steps is we're going to set up a small working group and start driving it that way. So yeah, please get in contact if you want to be part of it. And I can think it doesn't necessarily have to be just at Parramatta River scale. I think it's very applicable across Sydney or any metropolitan or urbanised catchment. So I'm going to throw to Nell just quickly to see if there's any questions because we are running a little over time today.
Yes, we have a couple of questions. So one was in relation to the tools, and do any of those tools include the ability to calculate an estimate of life cycle costs?
At the moment, the recommendations paper we've
You've frozen, guys. In the middle of Alexa's answer. Can you hear me?
It's done really a lot of work on that as well, on the life cycle costing.
I think Nell, and I guess to the person who posed the question, life cycle analysis is important, and it speaks very much to how best you can sustain.
Sorry, guys. It's Christy. Sorry, guys, it's Christy. You guys actually cut out, so we didn't actually hear the answer. So we can, yeah.
Oh dear. Are we back?
All right.
Sorry. Back, Christy?
Yeah, you're back now. Sorry, we didn't hear it all.
Thanks, Christy. I thought they might have heard my message.
At the moment, the Blue-Green Index tool is just at a framework level. It doesn't include any detail, but whether it's right to include all the detail in one tool is questionable.
And I think the other side to life cycle analysis is the benefit analysis. And so often what I've seen in tools that have sought to apply a life cycle analysis perspective haven't captured all the benefits of the inputs, such as urban cooling benefits, habitat, etc. So there's an inherent dilemma if you go down that life cycle analysis pathway that you should concurrently try to value all the benefits that will otherwise come.
I agree. I guess I just from a council perspective, that's just something you know, we're struggling at the moment just to fund, you know, water sensitive urban design, and look, I think it's fabulous. I think it's a great tool, and I think we should be looking to implement it. But I think failing to include, as you've indicated, what are the costs and benefits of this, but also here's an option. You do these options, but this is an indicative annual costing and a renewal. Like, I think that's important for people to be aware of up front. Otherwise, this infrastructure is going to become like it won't function as it's intended. It, you know.
It's the reason why we've recommended a pilot as the first step, because what this really needs is to be tested on real Parramatta catchment development. Just run them through. What does it mean for all these different types of development? Does this result in realistic outcomes that we can support?
And it'd be great to have Blacktown involved in our working group, because, you know, you've got the S3QM model, and maybe you're looking at doing that life cycle costing as part of that model, and you'd have some insights to help us with that.
I guess one other quick point on that, Nell, is when we start to look at the effectiveness of existing water sensitive urban design systems, they are designed with the purpose that it minimises costs to meet the target. And essentially it's from a developer's perspective. When we start to then think about the future owner and future maintenance person, whether that's an individual household, a strata corporation or a council, we actually have different considerations. And so, you know, the capital design, minimum capital design compliance-based is actually a different proposition. We can call it the principal agent problem. So, you know, who owns the particular problem at any certain time? So we can talk much more about that another time. Nell.
Yeah, look, there's quite a few questions coming in. So another one from James McNamara is, how will you make developers implement any blue-green index tool? As developers are very compliance-driven and most only want to do the bare minimum.
So this is the ongoing policy dilemma that we have. And so we need sufficient flexibility, and we need to sell the advantages of an integrated blue and green landscape. And if for no other reason, you know, we've all got these wonderful examples of pretty ugly, functionally focused infiltration systems in the front yards of developments. And Alexa was struggling to find a good example and still couldn't. So the value proposition from the development sector is these become nice places. So we think about the front yard and the streetscape contributing to good design.
One of the things I hear from industry is they're asked to do all these individual things, and water sensitive urban design becomes one more ask on the list after landscape and deep soils and rainwater harvesting. But instead of asking them always for an additional thing, we can integrate.
Yeah.
All right. Look, we're running out of time, but there's one more question that's quite interesting. Would you see benefit in taking a similar approach to planning for bushfire protection? Specifically, this approach is based on performance criteria which has to be met by adopting acceptable solutions?
Yes,
okay.
I think the short answer is yes, because what planning for bushfire protection does, it has legitimacy through the planning system as part of a state environmental planning instrument. And what that instrument does then is refer to a guideline that provides that tickles out that level of nuanced detail, option and opportunity. What it also does is provide, I guess, this external certification. So when you submit your application for a development proposal, an external person says, this complies with planning for bushfire protection or a green blue index guideline. And so the assessment officer, he or she can have certainty that it is a good design. It's a functional design. It's a purposeful design. And it's one that's meeting the outcomes.
It's not unique to water that we're trying to address more complex outcomes.
Actually, I just have one final question. Just clarifying, are you looking to address all typologies, i.e. individual houses, to riparian restoration, to town centres?
The short answer is yes. Yeah, a tool that provides pathways through, do you know, a little bit like Basics does at the moment. So if you're doing an individual house, you can navigate a fairly easy path through Basics. If you're doing a multi-unit development, there's a path through there too.
So whilst the short answer is yes, the nuanced answer is we have exempt and complying development types.
Yeah.
What you can't have is an instrument that is applicable to what we can call the mum and dad alteration and addition to a new dwelling compared to a regional development. So we need to think about not just the size of the lot, but also the population and its contribution by per capita, for example, in terms of the impact on the environment. So in a sense, larger developments, more expensive developments, higher density developments should have a greater onus to get better environmental outcomes than the individual small residential lot.
Set the bar higher for them, but they can all use the same framework.
Yeah. I'm going to wrap it up here because we are running a little bit over time. So I'd just like to thank Alexa and Peter. That was really good. Really appreciate your time. Don't forget, we've got another webinar next Tuesday and we will be talking about that riparian mapping and the riparian habitats. We just touched on that slightly there. We'll talk about that in a little bit more detail. So thank you very much for coming. The webinar recording will be made available and I'll let everyone who's come today get a copy of it. Thanks very much.